Welcome, everyone. Hello, my name is Mimi Zeiger, and I'm the co-curator along with Iker Gill of the 2020-21 cycle of Exhibit Columbus. We're proud to be partnering with Dezeen to broadcast this series of conversations as part of our 2020 Symposium, New Middles. Exhibit Columbus is a program of the landmark Columbus Foundation, whose mission is to care for, celebrate, and advance the cultural heritage of Columbus, Indiana. Exhibit Columbus creates a 2-year cycle of programming that activates the design legacy of Columbus through symposia and a free public exhibition, which will be in 2021. Our 2020 symposium asks international leaders in art, architecture, design, and landscape, together with the stakeholders in the Columbus community, to consider the question, what is the future of the Middle City? But before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to give a land acknowledgement and reflect on the long history of a city named for Christopher Columbus in a state named for Indians. The land where Columbus, Indiana is located was ceded to the United States in 1818 through the Treaty of St. Mary's. Yet this is a place that has been a site of human activity for more than 12,000 years through the rich and vibrant cultures of the Adena, the Hopewell, Cahokia, Shawnee, and Miami, the Kickapoo, and the Delaware nations. I join you today from Los Angeles, which is the traditional home of the Chumash, the Kish, and the Tongva peoples. We recognize that the languages, cultures, and traditions of these nations continue to this day, and although we're gathering virtually, we remained entwined by land, by water, and by soil. And perhaps today, also by internet. The topic of our conversation today is Indigenous futures and radical thinking. As curators, Iker and I have been thinking about the idea of new middles through the lens of the Mississippi watershed and the ways that the people, cities, and ecosystems are combined and intertwined, codependent. And we're also thinking about the middle as a center point, a pivot between the history of a place or a region and what comes next, which seems especially necessary right now as we as individuals and as a collective reflect on past injustices and also scramble to cope with pandemic and climate crises. As such, a long timeline is central to this conversation today, which asks what are the lessons past and future of this land and Indigenous design, and how might recentering historically suppressed voices and marginalized perspectives in relations to land or agriculture, and also ways of making, reimagine North American, or rather Turtle Island narratives. I'm honored today to join in conversation a powerfully insightful group of makers and thinkers. Designer Chris Cornelius of Studio Indigenous, the Land Institute founder Wes Jackson, and artist and architect Yor Nongo, and speculative artist and designer Ash Eliza Smith. We'll start our program today by hearing from each of them, and then we'll follow up with a discussion and some questions from our audience. So if you'd like to ask a question, please send it through the live chat on Dezeen's Facebook page or in the comment section of the article. So with that, we'll begin with Chris Cornelius. Chris is a citizen of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin and associate professor of architecture at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And this spring, he will be a visiting professor at Yale. His design practice, Studio Indigenous, serves Indigenous clients, and in 2017, he was a recipient of the Exhibit Columbus J. Irwin and Xenia S. Miller Prize. In 2018, he exhibited as part of the Venice Architecture Biennale. Hi, Chris. Thanks for joining us. And I'm looking forward to hearing about your practice and the way it bridges from working closely with communities and stakeholders to the more speculative and exploratory ideas expressed in your beautiful drawings and your Exhibit Columbus installation, Wikiyami. Thank you, Chris.
Wat kuf nuela du, Chris Nyongets, Aquahoni Wagita Loda, Okale, Oniata Aka, Nwagadahon Choda. I said in Oneida that I extend my greetings, love, and thankfulness to all of you. I am Chris Cornelius of the Wolf Clan, and people of the Standing Stone is the earth that I come from. So today I'm going to talk a bit about my work and kind of contextualize the work. And for me, the idea or notion here is that indigeneity is futurism, and how am I going to, as a designer, pull those things into the future, meaning the things that Indigenous people think about. And I also think that we can change the ways that we're teaching architecture and design as an architectural educator. And that's the notion here of changing the canon, right? We don't talk about the first American architecture, really, first multi-story buildings being pueblos, and first cities being pueblos as well, or Mesa Verde being amazing masonry technology, but we should be. And so I like to think about the idea or notion that design is ceremony, that it's not just an activity, but it is a ritual. For me, it is, and all aspects of it. From the beginnings of it, from making things, building things, the process of construction, thinking about where materials come from, who made them, how do they install them. It's not just about the sort of end user and the life of the building going forward, but what was its life before it was a building. What am I, or where am I placing this thing, and how am I affecting the inhabitants of that particular place? That was something that Antoine Predock and I really thought about when we worked on this project. This is the project that really kind of launched my practice studio, Indigenous. I was asked to be a part of the design team with Antoine Predock. And in 2003, which was shortly after I graduated grad school. And so it really it's actually like working with Antoine was like going to grad school again. To be honest, I really learned a lot from him. And I think that he was really the right person to kind of design this particular place. We had a lot of things in common in the way that we thought about the project. It's a K4 through 8 school. It's a private school just southwest of Milwaukee, the Indian Community School of Milwaukee. And students have to only prove Native ancestry to attend the school. It's about 320 or 320 to 330 students that go there. This is the student entrance. We call it migration. So we tried to strip all of the programmatic terms that were institutional in a school away, meaning we call it migration. We never called the place that they eat the cafeteria. We call it feast. We don't call the entry the lobby. It's community, and that's something that is carried through the project. And so when we were looking at the beginning of the project, we started to really understand that in order to inhabit the site, and we thought of the building as an animal, we had to think about all of the animals in the site. And so I did this image that is basically everything from the site level below, and then everything between the site and the moon. So it changes scale vertically. So if we were going to talk about or think about the animals that burrow into the ground, how were we going to do that when in spots that the building might do that? We thought about migratory bird patterns. We thought about that ritual of students coming in and out every day as being a migration. And we thought about the seasonal winds, how do those things begin to affect the site, and thinking about this as a whole thing, right? Meaning a sort of vertical continuum, a stratigraphy of places that cover the site, and how we begin to think about how we were intervening in that. 2018, I did this residency at Bookworm Gardens in Sheboygan, just north of Milwaukee. And so I created this installation I call The Trickster. And because it's a children's literature garden, I was thinking about how the role of the trickster and what it does in Indigenous storytelling. And it's usually there to teach us lessons. Sometimes it's an animal, sometimes it's some other sort of phenomena. But in the stories, the trickster is there to tell us things about our own sort of human weaknesses, our vulnerabilities, about vanity and greed and things like that. So this thing defies program and form, really, to be honest. What I wanted to do is to get it to go beyond those things. And for the children that were visiting there, start to tell their own stories about the thing, why it's there, and how it came to be. I did a second one for an exhibition, group exhibition. I won an artist fellowship called the Knoll Fellowship here in Milwaukee. And so in this group exhibition, I had the chance to build one inside. The piece itself has what I call its regalia. The idea or notion that regalia in indigenous culture is basically hyper ornament, meaning like it's not just symbolizing one thing, it can symbolize many things. It might talk about who we belong to. I might have something that is about the Wolf Clan, where we came from, accomplishments, those kinds of things. And so in this case, the trickster wanted to wear that sort of regalia in the gallery. And so I built this out of trees that were harvested from the Linden Sculpture Garden nearby, and I used the same sort of copper mesh on the exterior of that. And the Wikiami for me was an opportunity to bring an indigenous voice to Columbus, to pull out that history, for really to ignite the idea or notion that indigenous people inhabited this land before Europeans. That history was a little bit difficult to find, to be honest, like who actually inhabited that land. And so I focused on the Miami or the Miamia people, and Wikiami is the Miamia word for wigwam, their traditional structures. I try not to replicate forms, meaning I would want this to look like a wigwam. That it was a particular structure that came out of a particular time. What I am more interested in is the sort of what were the tectonic components of that, the idea that there was this frame and a cladding. And so this has a steel rebar frame, expanded steel cladding. I call it its feathers. Those things were the things that I wanted people to begin to think about. And in that way, the piece for me stands as a land acknowledgement in the piece. I will say that the making of this piece was the first installation that I did. I was very happy to win the Miller Prize. It's really been an extraordinary experience for me. I learned a lot of things. This thing taught me a lot of lessons. So in that way, the thing itself, I'm learning who I am as a designer, how it is to make these things, not both in a pragmatic way, but in a kind of like, what should I be doing? How should I be doing it? And relying on other people. Forcia was a great company that helped me. I mean, the thing wouldn't exist without them, really. But all of those lessons about how do I make this thing were things that I started to learn from that experience. So I'm happy to have had that piece there for almost 2 years. For me, drawing is medicine. The idea that the act of drawing is a kind of ritual, and it's a thing that I do to make myself feel better, and it's part of that ritual of design, right? For me, designs always begin with drawing. And so I, many years ago, when I started drawing in sketchbooks, I started to realize that I don't need to erase anything, and I stopped erasing things. I like to draw over things, meaning that I do believe that we draw how we think, ideas that are starting to percolate are starting to emerge. You might draw very lightly. As those ideas get more concrete or you start to make bigger decisions, you might darken things in it. So you'll see in the sketchbooks that they're kind of layered. And at this time too, I was always drawing with graphite and watercolor, but I started splashing the page because for me, it was like, this is part of the ritual. It's part of this, like, I'm not trying to make a super pristine drawing, but for me, that becomes a life as in part of the drawing. I feel like the ways that I draw are, I don't have to think about what the thing is before I draw it. Just like I wouldn't have to think about the words that I would say. It might be a kind of utterance or gibberish. But for me, it's just like, that's what the splashing and other things sort of start to do. And so projects started to emerge out of the sketchbook, and I started to build these models of speculative kind of structures where I wasn't really quite sure whether it was a person and an animal was making these things. And so I started to think about, what if architecture wasn't a metaphor for something else, really? Like, what if it was just a sort of natural thing? And I was interested in working in these materials, bronze, copper, brass, and soldering these things. And so these were the kind of predecessors to Wikiami. Sometimes the pages in my sketchbook are really just about testing techniques, drawing things, ideation before they become a thing. So this sketch, which won K-Rob Prize, is that, right? It's this idea that I'm even scribbling on the thing. What are even the gestures that I make with the watercolor or the pens, how can those things start to change? This also won a K. Robb Prize for best hand drawing. And this is a speculative dwelling. I have a series of these dwellings. And again, I'm not thinking about whether these are built by humans or architects, really. We're not quite sure what the references are, and whether the animals are inhabiting these things or people are. And this one, the structure, I was thinking about, what if it was just a bundle of sticks instead of columns or walls? What if it were a bundle of sticks? And what if the thing could harvest rainwater? So the bear is pulling out this thing. He says, I roll out the cloud to make it rain. Again, in these drawings, I'm not erasing anything. And so the last thought I'll leave you with is this idea of decolonization and what it really means to me. If we see colonization and for what it is an apparatus. It is a structure, it is a system, and that system needs to be dismantled. And I believe as Indigenous people, we should be dismantling the thing from the inside. We shouldn't just be critiquing it from the outside, protesting from the outside. For me, it's important to be inside. It's important for me to be in the academy, to be in the profession, to be a part of the conversations, to begin to dismantle that system. So I'm working on a research project I've been working on for a few years and still in process, where this idea where I was examining the American Indian occupation of Alcatraz Island, which happened from November of 69 to June of 71. And they occupied the island, but they didn't want it for economic or political gain. They wanted to make a native university, an ecological center, a cultural center. And so I wrote a grant proposal that was funded. And I speculated that they got what they wanted. They got part of the island, the southern end of it, to make a native university. And so for me, I'm examining that and everything that kind of goes along with that. And this is a kind of heavy project for me because I have to bring in all of these Indigenous issues. Why would these people be so angry to begin to think about why they would occupy this land? And they occupied it through a treaty, the Treaty of Fort Laramie. With the Lakota people, the U.S. government said any land we deem surplus you can have. And so they took it because it was surplus land at that time. So part of the drawing and making for me, I use digital tools and the 3D printing and other sorts of things, but the drawing itself is kind of meditative in that regard. So I want to leave you with this last thought that Indigenous people have been living in a post-apocalyptic world since 1492. Right? The apocalypse has already happened for us. And if we're going to go forward, and the lessons that we can have and offer are lessons that have been around for thousands and thousands of years. And so when you hear Indigenous people say things like, we want the land back, give us the land back, it's not just in a sort of property ownership way, but to begin to think about, we understand the land differently than other people, right? We know how to manage forests to prevent forest fires. These things are not new things. They couldn't have never happened in the past 50,000 years, right? Those things happened. How were Indigenous people taking care of the land? How were Indigenous people educating ourselves? How were we building? And for me, architecture is that thing. I feel like now I have to begin to think about how I'm making architecture in this post-apocalyptic world. At one point, 1491, we were 100% of the US and Canadian population. Now we're barely 1%, right? And so the apocalypse has happened, and we should be talking about it in that regard. For me, these are lessons that I'm trying to embed in the work and trying to project into the future what those things actually are. And Douglas Cardinal has said this, and I completely agree with him, is that elders' teaching is not really about the past. It's about the future. When elders are teaching us things, it is about the future. And I believe that to be true. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Really sort of happy that you're introducing this idea of the post-apocalyptic and the idea of sort of that indigenuity is already futurity, because I think this will come up and sort of start to link this conversation together. Next up is Wes Jackson, and he's joining us from Salina, Kansas today. And I just have to say it's a real privilege to have Wes here today. He's the co-founder and president emeritus of the Land Institute. His work with the Land Institute and his numerous articles and books ask that society deeply reconsider its largely extractive relationship with land and with place, And his writings on perennial agriculture and ecology are foundational in understanding just why culture must move towards sustainability. Wes is currently at work on a new book, and we're excited that he could take time out from writing to share some of his thoughts today. So thank you, Wes, for being with us.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm pleased to be here, and now I've got to get Chris to come to the Land Institute. There's no question about that. We'll arrange that right away, just as soon as the virus is over, because we've got to have you. So thank you for your presentation, a most useful one. Well, it was back in '77, a year after we started the Land Institute, that I took my students on a trip to the Kanza Prairie, which is never plowed native prairie. And while there, we had a wonderful tour, field trip by a local ecologist. And I came away from that thinking, why can we not have an agriculture based on the way the prairie works? The architecture of the prairie features perennial plants grown in mixtures. That's the ecosystem of the prairie. And our agricultural system are annual plants, mostly grown in monocultures, and therefore we have soil erosion and the loss of the ecological capital due to rain and wind. And so that's what set me off. And so we have been working to develop perennial grain polyculture all these years. And we now have the first perennial grain ever. It's our kernza, a relative of wheat. And but if we stop with perennial grain monoculture, we've missed half the point. So it's not just plant breeding, it's also ecology. So we look at the ecosystem as a conceptual tool for agriculture and also as a conceptual tool for society in general. Diversity and being dug in somewhere. So, but one thing that of course was clear right from the beginning, even before we got into the genetics, plant breeding, ecology stuff, it was clear to me that you don't just develop an agriculture and have a satellite of sustainability that's orbiting the extractive economy. It's going to get sucked into the vortex of the larger world. And so then when I retired after 40 years, which is a little over 4 years ago this month, well, right before I retired, we had hired a bright young PhD from the University of Nebraska, Aubrey Strike Krug, and Aubrey learned the Omaha language. And so immediately we made her our director of ecosphere studies. And Aubrey is, there's a small group of us now working on what we call ecosphere studies. And the whole thing comes down to this, that yes, the apocalypse happened in 1492, starting in December, but there was an apocalypse some 10,000 years before that at the eastern end of the Mediterranean, where Homo sapien began to develop annual grain monocultures. And, you know, you can call that the biblical fall. That was the beginning of the loss of ecological capital on a global basis. And so what the Europeans did was bring that to the Caribbean and to North America, brought the fallen world's ways to this continent and the southern continent. So here we have then here we now have lots of indigenous leaders that are trying to show us the way. And here's the problem as I see it. One is we're going to have to learn both the high and the low, and how to get there, because humanity now has to face the big turn to move away from the highly dense carbon, the fossil fuels. We started using dense carbon when we started agriculture and got at the young pulverized coal of the soil. And then we had 5,000 years later, the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. And then we get the coal, the oil, the natural gas. And what that has done is change both the speed and the scale for those involved in industrial societies. So, so how are we going to learn both the high and the low? There's no one knows. No one knows how we're going to make it. No indigenous leader can tell us how to get there. I mean, they all will all be contributing, but we're desperate for meaning. Right now, humanity is desperate for meaning, and meaning is not instilled in the universe. Meaning is there's been no selection, no Darwinian selection for us to have meaning. We make that up, and we make it up as we go along. So despite, you know, kind of knowing the problem, we don't have a kind of an existential sense on what to do that's trustworthy. And it looks to me like morality won't save us. We need a habit to use less energy, and no one wants to do it. So the right doesn't care about it. The center to the left doesn't seem to get it, and the independent are uninspired. And so here we are, sort of all alone, scared to challenge all that's said. And but what this comes down to is that this is about our food, clothing, shelter. And so so the big question is, how are we going to make this term? Well, one of the oldest problems that will never be satisfied, and that is the distinction between determinism and free will. Some things are just, a spirochete goes to the light. There are just instincts that immediately take over. And then we also recognize there's some free will. But there is an invisible line between the two. And it seems that because all creatures are carbon-based, going all the way back to 3.45 billion years, we go after energy-rich carbon. And so, and there's a certain determinism in it. We can't say no. If you have bacteria on a petri dish with sugar, they just eat it until they hit the edge. And then what we do, we develop an economic system. But we recognize that some people are making more progress to the edge of the petri dish than others. And so we do some social justice so we can all hit the edge of the petri dish at the same time, I guess. All right, so the larger point being here is that we've got to figure out a way to deal with our deterministic behavior. And therefore, we come to the need to put a cap on the carbon, the highly dense carbon, and have rationing. And then we begin to operate within our limits. Now, where am I on time? How many minutes? Am I over?
No, not yet, Wes. Take another minute or so.
Got another minute. So, what it seems to me that we're going to have to think about is we're all living within an apocalyptic world now. I mean, most all of us. And in fact, if you look up the meaning of the word apocalypse, of course, there's the Greek, but then the Romans had revelation. They're synonyms. And it doesn't have to do with the New Testament, John, the book of Revelation, so much as how do we deal with a power structure? It's how are we going to manage within this fallen world? And we're still creatures of the upper Paleolithic. I mean, we've been around with the big brain 200,000 years. We've been into agriculture only 10,000 years, and on this continent since 1492, into an apocalyptic system. So I've been saying, and they've taken it as a sort of a funny idea, but I'm getting more serious about it. To have a sign out on interstate coming into Salina, we have two interstates coming in here, and put up a sign that says the Land Institute Center for Post-Apocalyptic Studies. Now, we could be quite serious about that, but as soon as you say that, well, you can just imagine driving on by that sign. But the larger point being is we're lost. We don't know how to make the turn. We know what needs done, but we can't make ourselves do it. And so this is what Bob Jensen and I, Bob Jensen is a retired professor at the University of Texas. He and I are working on a book that addresses this very question, how to deal with this deterministic behavior in a post-apocalyptic world, because we're concerned about climate change, the loss of soil erosion, the chemical contamination of our land and water. We've totally validated the introduction of chemicals in our land and water through agriculture that our tissues have no evolutionary experience with. I mean, this is about as dumb as it gets. And it's because of the imperative of the highly dense carbon, we think. So that's enough for now.
Thank you, Wes. This is not only is it enough, it's so rich, and I look forward to unpacking it more. I especially appreciate this idea of learning to work with the high and the low, because I think some of our participants in this call today are doing such that, are kind of really kind of blending between different states. And to that point, our next speaker is Jornango, and he's joining us today from Tromsø, Norway. Jor is a Sami of the Sami people and a Norwegian architect and visual artist. His work operates at these overlaps and intersections of disciplines and mediums, which those are then entangled with his Sami heritage and also with Western culture. His work has been shown at the 2019 Chicago Architecture Biennial and in Documenta in 2017. He's also a co-founder of the architecture collective FFB, and he uses this term, which is a kind of mashup of maybe high and low, of indigenuity, this mashup of indigenous and ingenuity, to speak to the ad hoc methods in his work and in Sami practices of making. So with that, I'd like to welcome Jor.
Thank you, Mimi. Thanks for inviting me into this interesting panel. Really great. I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to try my best to be as efficient as possible to say a few smart things. I'm educated an architect working mostly with art. I'm going to show you 6 or 7 slides today, which takes you through sort of the very beginning of my I guess art practice as an indigenous architect, and end with some later projects. I'm trying to show you some kind of diverse and different ways of thinking about indigenous space and placemaking, which is what I'm mostly been working on these last 15 years as a practicing artist. I'm going to share my screen. Yeah. As an architect, young architect student, I was quite astonished by the lack of knowledge and discourse around the colonial history of the Scandinavian nations. So being a Sami living in Norway, it was a frustrating and disappointing revelation for me to realize that the Sami architecture, the indigenous, which is the indigenous people of my region, were not even mentioned in the sort of architectural history curriculum of my study program. It left me feeling very frustrated and I guess in some ways quite angry. So since that on, I've been sort of trying to do something with that. You can say that what I'm doing is maybe not necessarily build and construct Sami spaces. I'm maybe more interested in creating and constructing this spaces for discourse concerning what indigenous identities and sort of decolonial narratives of Northern European architecture is. There's a huge lack of awareness about our colonial history on European soil within Europe. And we are one of the peoples without a nation state, with our completely different culture, different language, different history, which has been in these areas since time, I don't know, immemorial. Yeah, and so I think it's about time, and it has a very high importance to raise questions about these kind of issues. And to do that, you have to look at history. You have to look backwards in time, and you have to sort of retrace some of these historical narratives that can be read through architecture as well. That's what I'm working with these days. But starting this research on my Sami culture and the architectural heritage that we have, I did a lot of research. I made a little magazine that came out in 3 issues, which I was the editor and the writer of. It's called Sami Hugsendaida. I was looking at traditional architecture. I was looking at built environment, a bit inspired by the sort of environmental behavior studies and Amos Rappaport and these kind of architects. But I was also looking at the contemporary built institutional architectural world of my culture. We have a lot of buildings built for cultural purposes, schools, museums, art galleries, parliament buildings, different medical centers, buildings that are built with this kind of very conscious attempt from the designers to make a building for Samic culture which has some sort of an indigenous design embedded to it. I discovered one thing pretty quickly, and that was that nearly half of these buildings that I found were all using the same strategy when they were trying to build an architecture for my culture, a Sami architecture. And that was that they were using this traditional Sami architectural typology, that the lavu, which is very similar to the North American teepee, which is a conical shaped tent used by the reindeer herding nomads. It's very iconic, it's very recognizable. And I realized that there was such a big amount of these buildings that it was almost as if it was some kind of a syndrome. And I, in a jokingly way, kind of coined it the giant lavu syndrome, trying to raise not only a critical sort of discourse within the field of architecture, but also trying to reach out to the Sami community itself, trying to ask the question, how do we want to represent ourselves through architecture? And what are the different sort of options that we have in this kind of for this task? So this became sort of a first stepping stone for me, dealing with the concept of indigenous identity and representation through architecture. None of these buildings are designed by Sami architects. They're all designed by outsiders. So I think what we're looking at here is some sort of a Edward Said's idea about Orientalism sort of finding its way into architecture. And then again, Robert Venturi's thinking when it comes to the use of symbols within architecture in his learning from Las Vegas studies are very sort of relevant Western architectural theories that I try to sort of throw into this type of research. Yeah. Yeah. So in extension of that, jumping a few years now, I realized that, you know, through my studies about Sami architecture, I had actually acquired quite an enormous amount of literature and archival material. I was gathering everything that had been done in relation to the competitions of all these buildings, or few of these buildings. Some of them had open international competitions. There's a lot of competition entry. There's also that sort of, I don't know what the English word is, but the pre-work that you do before you launch a competition. It's quite an extensive work that's already done there within our field of architecture, which all of you architects know. And so gathering all this material, I was sort of in a bit like kind of manic way, trying to gather everything I could find that had any sort of relevance for Sami architecture. I was scavenging through old ethnological and ethnographic sources, Xerox copying, tearing out pages from library books, and slowly building this archive that now is more than 250 books, a lot of copies, a lot of videos, and also things found from the internet. And then I built this small mobile library, which you see here, which is called the Sami Architectural Library. It's built within a small, like in a small reindeer herding hut that's used as a sort of a mobile small shelter wintertime, but amongst the reindeer herders. And it's a mobile architectural library that takes that sort of travels between different cultural arenas of the Sami area, trying to create the discussion. There's usually a program connected to it, like seminars. We invite speakers. We do sort of conversational gatherings, I guess, talking about architecture, all within this sort of small scale type of architectural space that's temporary. It's improvised. It's built out of secondhand material, and it's much, in so many ways, built around my aesthetic ideas about nomadism. Then again, I took this library over to Canada, and it's actually at the moment installed in the National Gallery of Canada in the foyer there, where I built a similar structure that has the same sort of set of books, a little bit expanded, trying to sort of take this same conversation that I took from back home about Sami architecture into a more global and international sort of scale, talking about indigenous architecture. What is indigenous architecture, and how could this, how could we sort of develop our own sort of ideas from an indigenous worldview about architecture. Chris here was also actually a part of these conversations. So he did a wonderful talk as part of this library and archival material. Then another project, again, a little bit later, which was from last year, where I was invited to do a piece in the Chicago Architectural Biennale, much inspired by one of my sort of big heroes as an architect student, Juhani Pallasmaa, who once said, if you want to create something new, you have to look for that which is ancient. I think it's a beautiful quote, and I think there's something in that I wanted to explore in this project. And this is a project that's basically, it took its point of departure from a word that I found in an old dictionary, which was the word skjevar, which was a word describing a halibut stomach skin dried and spanned over a wooden frame used as a window. I found no sort of visual or other sort of information on this type of architectural prehistoric element, using guts to make windows. So I decided to do it on my own, and this is the result. So for a year, I was collaborating with a local fisherman, also Sami from this area, taking the stomachs and experimenting. And throughout, some months of failing and trying, I realized how these skins should be treated. I sewed them together with reindeer sinew. And then I made this projection and a video piece with two other artists from my home community and installed it in the Yates Hall in Chicago. I think this is an interesting way of sort of trying to play around with these ideas about the ancient and the futuristic. And in a sort of joyful text production accompanying the piece, I called it some kind of a future primitivism as a new sort of, I guess, genre. There's other ways of dealing with this sort of concepts of nomadism and traditions. And this is another example. I established in 2010 an architectural collective called FFB. It was an attempt to actually step a little bit away from myself always presenting myself as indigenous, and in that way always sort of positioning myself as in some sort of a power position. I wanted to sort of step out of that and maybe try to make something more diverse, more collective. So there's two other non-Sami persons involved in this establishment of this architectural collective. This project is called Searching for Smooth Space. We built a structure that's a traditional Sami turf hut structure, parallel to making reading groups where we were reading Deleuze and Guattari's 1,000 Plateau, which is basically, it's the most sort of referenced book in all art academies. It's a book that talks about nomadology as a concept. So talking about nomadology in this sort of like bit like virtual intellectual conversations surrounded by this like workshop where we were teaching, or I was teaching the participants to build in a traditional Sami way using axe, harvesting from the local nature around where we were building. And then in the end, I wanted to show another example that sort of deals with the same, I guess, ambition of trying to, you know, take a point of departure from an indigenous way of working with nomadology and scavenged material and the philosophy of indigenuity, which I haven't talked so much about now, but maybe I'll talk about another time. But taking that as a point of departure and trying to make a space that is inclusive and that is for everyone. And this is a project which I did with the same architectural collective. It's called the Norwegian Roma Embassy. The Roma people of Europe are the sort of the most underprivileged people. So a lot of still existing and accepting form of racism towards them. And they had for many years, for a couple of decades, been trying to get a cultural gathering place for the Oslo city, towards the Oslo county. And they didn't get that through. So me and the collective, we started to collaborate with them, and throughout the period of 2 years, we managed to finally build a temporary cultural house for them, which was the start of a process of actually realizing a project that opened last year, which was a permanent building. Yeah. So I guess I gotta stop there. I'm not used to talking this fast through these things, but there's a lot to be talked about there. So thank you.
Thank you, Yor. Yeah, I love the Skeva project. It's what first brought me to your work, and I think this kind of cyclical notion of drawing from the past and even doing a deep textual reading in order to then collaborate and bring us to the future is so interesting and beautiful. And I think this connection of moving from something maybe older technologies to newer technologies brings us to our last speaker, Ash Eliza Smith. Ash is an artist and a researcher and assistant professor of emerging media arts at University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Her practice melds storytelling, world building, and speculative design to shape new realities. And while so often when we think of future narratives and science fiction, we're concerned with utopian dreams for high-tech megacities, Ash's work focuses on rural-urban ecologies and what she's lovingly called the speculative flyover. Welcome, Ash. I'm excited to hear more about how you reimagine the past and future at these edge conditions of nature and technology.
Thank you, Mimi. One moment. All right. Okay. Hi, you can hear me. Yes. Hi, everyone. I am happy to be here today. As Mimi said, zooming in from Lincoln, Nebraska, and I'm going to speak. I'm actually going to try to summarize my talk pretty quickly because I think that the talks that just went have so many amazing, I'm sure people have questions and I'd love to hear more from those. So I'm going to try to keep this short. So yes, Lincoln, Nebraska is also a middle city, and as some people say, flyover land. But I'm here to hopefully challenge this notion that the rural can be challenged as both an imaginary and as a necessary link to urban supply chains. And so this role of place really does become an important starting place to build this imagination, to consider how cities and technology shape us and how we in turn shape them. As Mimi said, I work across art and science, between fact and fiction, and with human and non-human agents to reimagine past and future technologies, systems, and rural urban ecologies. So to me, a non-human is an animal, a robot, a mushroom. And for several years, I've been lucky now to return back to Appalachia, where this film still is taken from, to work on a project, a narrative design project called Southern Devices. And I worked on this with filmmaker Raber Umpenhauer to consider the future of our digital bodies, our data, and how those questions are connected to land, extraction, and deep time. I'm going to speak more about this in a second. But first, about the storytelling. I have just launched a lab here that does focus on storytelling and world building and speculative design as tools. And I'm really concerned with thinking about how story is a methodology that can shape these, not just the built environment, also the emerging technology that we ourselves build, and planetary or One Health. How can deep time use media arcology, past and future technology, systems thinking, and circular economies? How can it use story? What can story do for it, and what can it do for story? And so another, I think, unique approach to kind of what we're doing in the lab is really drawing on my foundation in performance and performance studies as both an object and a lens. For me, performance includes liveness, embodiment, movement, dance, music, theater, play, affect, and using everything from improvisation to live action role play as tools. I believe design is performance and design is ritual. So the approach to much of this work is about collaborative or collective storytelling or world building. World building in general is a practice that throws out the idea of the singular narrative or grand narratives, and it opens up a space to contain multitudes of stories told by many different kinds of people. I often work with scientists and engineers or emerging technologists interdisciplinarily. And I think that interdisciplinary work is another way to get through these silos and singular versions of expertise and ways that we can break down those silos. And I think that when artists and scientists work together, we have to listen to one another because we aren't even using the same language, and we have to actually get beyond language. While I was a fellow at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and this is an image from an installation there, we were working how to get people to care about climate change. And we used sonic data that was collected from the Ross Ice Shelf in Antarctica and remixed it as a sound installation that you're invited to lay upon and hear the sound. But I want to be clear that this piece is as much about what data can tell us as what it cannot tell us, and what are the limits of sensing systems. This next slide, well, our storytelling and world building draws from much of the work being done right here in Nebraska. So robots are growing food, cow spas are run by robots, dogs sniffing out diseases in humans. The human is still part of the loop, but the human may not be at the center of the loop. A current project around public health and science communication right here in Nebraska. My lab, we're working with Nebraska One Health, which I mentioned earlier. And Nebraska One Health connects these ideas of humans, animals, plants, and ecosystem health to think about how network science might solve problems. The photo here is from a project PGA that I did with Stephanie Sherman and Raber Umpenhauer that follows a group of indigenous endangered bighorn sheep that live on a mountainside beside a golf course. And they adapt to chemical composites of the artificial lands as a result of the grass being fertilized by pesticides to keep it immaculate for the PGA golf tournament in the dry desert outside of Palm Springs, California. And so here really questions about what is artificial and what is natural emerge. Going back to that first project, Southern Devices, this took me back to where my parents lived in Appalachia, surrounded by 3 large data centers. And it's important to note that when I say emerging technology, it actually could be an analog or past technology that has been reframed or reincorporated. And by technology, I mean language, money, bread, as well as a VR headset. And so if we're talking about the digital, how can we still create a thread back to the material? And so with something as light seeming as a data cloud, it is still connected to the extraction of resources via energy from data centers, mineral mining for our gadgets and devices, labor, bodies, market value, and on the other end, tech hardware for waste dumping. And it's also important to note that there's still very little internet and broadband in many rural areas. And if you look at the very bottom of this photo, you'll note that there are some sheep down there. And next to the servers in the field with this giant hum that's quite disturbing, there are these solar sheep who chew on grass. And these sheep are a part of a movement to unite solar power and agriculture, where solar and vegetation configurations are designed jointly for maximum dual output. And funny enough, you can't use goats here because they want to climb on all of the things like the solar panels. Here in Nebraska, we're doing a project or a course right now that's a rural urban design course using the idea of the back loop as a foundation. And I think this could be useful for this talk. The back loop, which was recently expanded upon by Stephanie Wakefield in the book Anthropocene Back Loop, comes from and widely used by resilience ecologists. Every system, meaning a forest, a body, a city, goes through a cycle with 2 phases, the front loop and the back loop, together making this adaptive cycle. And the back loop of those structures is where structures come apart, leading to a period of destabilization, fragmentation, confusion, and release, but also great potential for experimentation, reorganization, and transformation. And lastly, I just want to say that when I was back in North Carolina, I interviewed people about the data corridor, about the future of their data bodies and the cloud. And although some expressed concerns about privacy and surveillance and how their digital twin may be used in the future, most people expressed the most concern about what would happen with their data after they die. Some see it as an archive that will live on, and others more like hoarding, riddled with guilt about who might have to clean it out. And so oftentimes it's not about starting with fiction to build new worlds, but to start with reality to inspire new stories. And story, I believe, lays the groundwork for how we will build worlds, both physically and speculatively, how the middle city might reimagine itself in the future, and how we can listen to the narratives lost along the way. Thank you.
Thank you, Ash. This is so great. Just want to let our audience know that we'll go over by about 10 minutes. So hang in with us so that we can have a conversation. I want to note that there's this shared interest across all our speakers today in breaking down dualities between human and nature, between past and present, between Western and Indigenous ways of making. And I think that for many people, even many designers, working in that in-between space, between disciplines or worldviews, can seem a bit complicated or overwhelming. And I want to maybe ask about sort of how do you balance this practice of the in-between in your own work, and why is it important to sort of exist at these crucial intersections? No takers?
Well, for me, it was, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I knew I wanted to be an architect before I started to realize how I was going to integrate my culture into that. And that seemed like the way that it was supposed to happen to some extent. Like I needed that education. And so for me, the education was an emancipation. It was really like, how do I begin to incorporate my culture into that? And then what kind of voice can I make or have within the discipline in both of these worlds? I will say that it is difficult sometimes. It's difficult to be an academic sort of researcher kind of person on my own culture when I'm living it. And even the people of my own culture in Oneida, they, because I grew up on the reservation, the culture doesn't always want to be examined in these kind of scholarly ways. And it also doesn't want to be pushed forward as much as we might think. It's really a sort of slow geological moving, almost geological timeline that we're on. So for me, it's almost like I'm surfing a wave that is hopefully will never end, but I have to continually kind of move to be able to adapt to that. And so that's kind of how I feel like for me, it's not as conscious, but I feel like I'm trying to advance both both architecture and an indigenous culture at the same time. That's why for me, that's being part of that, part of the apparatus and being able to dismantle it. That's where or at least that's how I think about it.
Yeah. Well, I think pretty much understand why agriculturists have to be prescriptive to prescribe what to do, because our food supply is on the line. Ecologists have the luxury to be descriptive. And those are two worlds. And those two worlds exist here at the Land Institute. The agriculturists come out of a tradition of the need to get yield and resistance to insects and pathogens. That's a burden. But now, I think, partly because we have perennials that can stay put, you don't have to tear the ground up every year. Now it's kind of like having new hardware. So here's an example of where the doing something that has not been done then brings the descriptive and the prescriptive together. And you look around in the world, there are other areas in which there's this kind of a dichotomy between the prescriptive and the descriptive. And I think it's even biblical. You find it in the Old Testament. The folks that were agriculturists, and the Cain and Abel myth, they didn't get the nod. It was the others. So anyway, this is, I think, an old problem that humanity has had to face, and I think we're facing similar problems now between rural and urban. And so we look to the rural for nostalgia, but then the imperative of highly dense carbon puts people in the cities. And then the next thing you know, we have serious problems developing, not the least of which making our food supply vulnerable. So these are always with us, but that's where the work is. And it will come through in agriculture, architecture, probably almost any discipline has these various problems.
Anyone else want to weigh in on the middle pieces?
I mean, I would just really quickly say that I think that in-betweenness is a really good space for also being a listener instead of kind of always being the solver. And I think it does a little bit what the or the like does, where it provides that interstitial where you can actually listen to other people and other things and ideas.
I like that idea of the or the kind of what we think of as the hedge maybe becomes a space for operation. In listening to all of you today, I was sort of making notes about some methods or techniques, right? I think at the beginning of this, we were sort of thinking like, well, what is the impact, or maybe what's the imperative that to take away? And I came up with like a really wide range of drawing, of genetics, of role playing, of rituals, of adaptive use, and I guess thinking through sort of like what are our techniques? Like this isn't about sort of harvesting the nostalgia of a certain kind of making, but these seem to be new tools that speak to maybe the imperative that Wes was asking about, like how do we move from the high to low? I was wondering if you had any other thoughts about like what we could add to this list, or sort of what could be missing. Only the big questions today.
I think one of the things too is that we have to kind of expand and really understand that there are different epistemologies, meaning like indigenous knowledge can't be encapsulated into a thing. And that's one of the things that I think that we need to understand. And whether that's as knowledge as a large base of understanding, or it's just about architecture and design. Indigenous design and architecture isn't a thing that's going to save the world, right? It's not going to be encapsulated like sustainability or the LEED platinum or whatever it is, right? Like it's not going to be able to be a singular solution in that regard. So if that's what you're looking for, then that's harder to kind of deliver on. But for me, it's being able to understand that, yes, maybe I need to expand this idea or notion of what is knowledge and what is technology, right? Like technology wasn't just futuristic. When I start to examine these indigenous dwellings, there's a lot of technology embedded in that, right? Like we're not making structures that you can have a fire in the middle of and have a door and a window and still stay warm, right? Just those ideas, simple notions, those were technologically advanced. And so for me, I don't think indigeneity is anti-technology. And how can we advance it? How can we begin to see and build new epistemologies that start to graft those things together? They raise concerns and questions, of course, when we start talking about craft and indigenous craft and traditional craft, how people were making things with their hands and how they're still making them. But the idea or notion that there are other epistemologies than the ones we've learned in our institutions or the ones that I'm teaching, how do we begin to expand those and understand that indigenous knowledge is a viable version of knowledge, right? That it is teachable. And for me, it's not just for indigenous people, although it has a different kind of resonance with indigenous people. It's not just for indigenous people, it's for the world. And I think it's always been intended as such.
Anyone else want to weigh in on this question? I think that the other thing that sort of begins to bridge all of this is this idea of storytelling. And I want to sort of think about like, well, what happens when the designer is not sort of the singular author, right? But is sort of about cultivating plurality and cultivating many voices in a way that's a different kind of storytelling, whether it's archiving a bunch of materials together within a library, and that becomes, as Yor had said, a space for discourse. I maybe just think about like how does storytelling become sort of a tool of architecture and design?
Yeah.
I think that there's like Chris says, I think there's a very interesting dimension to collectivity, and of course we're all sort of trained to be a bit allergic towards dichotomies, and trying to always sort of break this magnetizing, polarized worldviews that so many of these sort of Western philosophers have taught us for centuries. So embracing complexity is maybe something that we're all trying to do. And I think collectivity actually can be thought about as a format for doing exactly that. I think especially within architecture and art, which has this tendency of always lifting up the authors, searching for that sort of one identifiable creator of the brilliant design. I think that the format and the methodology that sort of evolves around collectivity is a very interesting and powerful one. And I think that that's something that my generation is really, we're all embracing. And I think that if that sort of bounce back on Chris's comment about indigeneity and indigenous knowledge being something that actually is not for only indigenous people. Yes, it's that as well in certain cases, but it is for everyone. And I think that the format of collectivity is a good sort of method to reach into that for everyone-ness.
Ash, I see you nodding.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I agree with so much being said there. I also think, though, that there are some, as much as I see, I think what Joar is like getting to is also this kind of fear of not being the author, or the fear of, you know, that singular narrative or having control over that. But I do think that on the other side, there are some dangers too of what, you know, is called, you know, maybe community participatory design or design charrettes, where you have really, sometimes those are really great for generating design and architectural projects. However, sometimes you see those being used as kind of a social practice in a way that are just stand-ins for, now I feel better about myself, now I'm still going to go on and erect whatever I wanted to erect in the first place. So I think, you know, finding a balance between what is just like the collective or the feel good around that, I think is important, and to call it out when it's happening in communities. So there's that. And then I think that also, I think that storytelling can also continue beyond the design into the like care and maintenance. And that's where the ritual and the performance of an architecture or design project comes in. So, you know, there are still people cleaning, still people working, et cetera. So it's not just about the build. So.
I do want to start to wrap this up because we've gone over quite a bit because the work is so rich here. I was thinking about Indigenous futures and some of the writings about that say that, you know, the singular future is really only the future of the colonizer, and that for Indigenous people, or for everybody else, frankly, we're living in a plural future. Like, we're already in it. I think we've already established that the apocalypse has happened, and we're living in these kind of plural futures which help us to survive. And I think that in having this conversation about collectivity and about other kind of tools and methodologies we might sort of draw from has been super productive today. I want to close with one last thought. In 2016, Wes, you spoke about the necessity of ecospheric healing, and you said that artists will come front and center in the minds of scientists, not for nicety, but for the practical necessity of helping us all expand our imagination as we expand our collective consciousness. And so I'm just so grateful to all of you, to Chris, Wes, Yor, and Ash, for expanding our imagination today and for spending time with us. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you.